Hey guys, this is version number 2. Okay, I wanted to welcome you all again to a new webinar we put together called Predators on the Prowl. And so what I wanted to do, I originally kind of set the title for this webinar about 6 months ago and didn't really start thinking about it until a couple of weeks ago. And the one thing that I realized is we often talk about those large, charismatic predators such as cougars or grizzly bears or wolves, and we often forget some of those smaller, middle of the road type of predators. And so I thought it'd be a really good thing to do to talk or spend about an hour talking about what we call mesopredators. They're kind of the middle of the road predators. And I was so lucky, I didn't realize it, but Robert Brewer, who's another Wildlife for You instructor, as well as a wildlife professor in Cleveland State, he is joining us. He's only by microphone only to hopefully clear up bandwidth, but he's going to chime in on a couple of these slides here. But what I hope to do is spend the next 45 minutes to an hour talking about those predators that are out there all the time that we rarely ever see or think about. And so sit back, relax, enjoy Predators on the Prowl. Get your typing fingers ready because I've got a lot of quizzes. I'm gonna quiz you on a lot of things because these are common animals in North America that you may not know about. So I want to test your knowledge of these predators on the prowl. So with that, let me go to my wildlife experience page. I'm definitely not going to spend too much time. You all know who I am. Daryl Radijak. I'm a wildlife biologist, career wildlife biologist. Spent most of my career in Tennessee, but I've been in the West for the last four and a half years. And so I just have a wealth of experience working with all sorts of wild animals, over 20, almost 25 years of experience working with wild animals. So the one thing I want you all to know is that the information that we give you on these Wildlife for You webinars, it's science-based information. This isn't because we stayed in a Holiday Inn or we read a book. This is because we do this for our careers and we study this not just through school, but through everything we do since school. And so it's really good information. So hopefully you retain it because the more you know, the better off you are and the better off wildlife is. So let's start by just talking about which animals we're going to talk about tonight, because I mentioned these mesopredators. And so what we're going to do, we're going to look at this order of animals that's found worldwide that's classified as carnivora. And we're going to use some of those Latin names from this Linnaean nomenclature. This is, remember way back when you were in grade school or high school where you learned, I used to remember it by King Phil came over from Genesee Street, but his kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. And so carnivora is this large order of animals that are mostly carnivorous, not completely carnivorous, but they're found worldwide. And there's a number of families that is found in this order of carnivora. And we're going to look at those really quick just to see what we're talking about. So when we're talking about all of the mammals within this order of carnivora, there's some families that you'll know. And so I'm going to quiz you, get your typing fingers ready. And so there's a big family out there called Ursidae. What animals belong to Ursidae? All right, that was an easy one. Oops. So bears belong to Ursidae. I was quick on my trigger finger there. And so those ursids, you have black bears, brown bears. There's 8 different species of bears found in Ursidae. Next big one is Canidae. Most people will know what Canidae animals are in there. That's going to be our wolves, all the canids. So wolves, foxes, the domestic dog, coyotes, anything like that, those belong to the family Canidae. Now the next one is going to quiz you. There's one that's called Mustelidae. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, but can you guess what animals belong in the Mustelidae family. Wolverine, badger, weasel, skunk. Well, I'll correct you in a little bit. Most of you have it right. Muskrats don't belong in Mustelidae. Muskrats are actually in the rodent family, Rodentia, or order. But in Mustelidae, I'm losing my cursor here. In Mustelidae, we have mostly weasel and weasel-like animals. So badger was correct. Otters was correct. Let's see what else you have there. There's a few other animals we'll talk about. Okay, so that's Mustelidae, those weasel-like animals. I keep losing my cursor. Okay. There is another big family. Well, this is actually is a rather small family called Procyonidae. Can anyone guess what's in Procyonidae? Kinkajous are in there. Very, very good, Allison. But there's a really common one in Procyon think of an animal that has kind of like a face mask on and a striped tail. Very good, Allison. Raccoons. And so animals like raccoons or ringtails, even the red panda is classified in Procyonidae. Okay, so then we're going to switch over. We have Felidae. Obviously, most people will know this. The opposite, well, I shouldn't say the opposite, but just like we have dogs, we have the cat order. So all the cats, whether or not it's the big cats or little cats. So cougars, tigers, lions, bobcats, they all belong to this family, Felidae. And then this is going to be one that's going to be really tough. If anyone gets this, I'll be very surprised. Part of the reason why you may not have ever heard of it is we don't have any North American animals in this family. Can anyone guess what might be in here? Robert, I'm even quizzing you. Nope. Okay. Well, this obviously is no fault of anyone because they're not found in North America. But this is the family that contains civets and mongoose. And so we don't have that in North America. That's probably why you may never have heard of Viveridae, but that's another family. And now there's only one more terrestrial one, and you'll guess what it is as soon as I put it up there. It's called Hyenidae, which is pretty easy. And so as you can imagine, hyenas belong to this family. So when you look at it, this is the whole order of Carnivora. So all of these families under Carnivora, this makes up all those animals classified as belonging to this order. And so that's throughout the entire world, and it's not that many. Believe it or not, the more you kind of look how things are broken down, the more things start to make sense. Now, I did mention these are all the terrestrial animals. Believe it or not, there are some animals or mammals classified in Carnivora that are aquatic. Can anyone guess what kind of animals? In fact, I'll give you a hint. They're sometimes called pinnipeds. Nope. Trish, that's a good guess with polar bears. Well, you're partially right. Seals belong to it. Polar bears belong to Ursidae. But there's actually three families in the pinniped subfamily or superfamily. So you have eared seals, you have earless seals, and you have walruses. Those are all carnivorous mammals, and so those fall under this order of Carnivora. And so when you look at it, these are all the animals in the world classified as within this family or within this order of Carnivora. And so what we're going to do, many of you have been on multiple webinars of mine, so I'm going to cross out bears. We're not going to talk about bears today because I probably have 20 different webinars based on bears. I'm also going to cross off the wolves. We've talked about wolves and foxes and coyotes. Got a number of webinars there. We've done a bunch on cats. So obviously I'm crossing off all the super sexy, large, charismatic ones. We're not going to talk about any of those. Since we all live in North America, I'm also getting rid of the civets and the mongoose as well as the hyenas. And so what we're going to focus, or I'm also throwing out the aquatic one. I'm not a marine biologist. So I'm crossing out all of those. That leaves us with two families we're going to talk about today. And the cool thing is they're really cool families. So we're going to spend the evening talking about all the animals in the family Mustelidae and Procyonidae. And I think it'll be really cool once we dive into this. So let's first talk about both of these families at once. Now this applies to all those other families in carnivora as well. But these are two animals that are within both of these families. So the raccoon belongs to Procyonidae, and that badger there belongs to Mustelidae. These are more or less classified as mesopredators. I mentioned it before, they're kind of the middle of the road predators, and they're vastly different than what we would consider. Come on, my mouse is acting squirrely. They're vastly different than what we would consider apex predators. And so an apex predator is top of the line. There's nothing that eats apex predators. Now these mesopredators are middle of the line. So although they eat other animals, these mesopredators can serve as meals for some of these apex predators. And so that's one way to kind of think of these mesopredators. They're smaller than apex predators in most situations. Not all. You could have an apex predator that's kind of small, but a lot of these mesopredators are kind of in the middle of that food chain, so they can be eaten by other animals. So that's a good way to understand mesopredators. So what we're going to do, we're going to dive into our first family, which is going to be this Procyonidae, and we're going to talk about it. Now, I will tell you that there are other families or other species in Procyonidae that are found around the world, but we're just going to focus on what we find in North America. Now, there's three main animals in Procyonidae that we find in North America. Someone already mentioned the first one, so everyone knows what that is. That's a raccoon. And if you look, the reason everyone knows what a raccoon is, they're pretty much found throughout North America. And so almost every child, every adult has seen a raccoon when they've gone camping. They've probably fed it marshmallows, which they shouldn't. But everyone is very familiar with a raccoon. Can anyone name, there's two other animals within this family that are found in North America. Can anyone guess what another one is? Not a ferret. Good try, Lori. It's not a ferret. That's actually in a different family. That's in Mustelidae. I tell you what. Let me put a picture of it up here for you. Oh, I already gave you the name. Believe it. Has anyone ever seen or heard of a ringtail? Oh, good job, Laura. I didn't realize that their range was as extensive as it is. But ringtails are found in a pretty good chunk of the southwestern half of the United States. And so all throughout Texas, California, even the state I'm in, I've never seen a ringtail. I would love to see one, but I have never seen one. And then there's one more that has a little bit smaller range in North America. Does anyone know what other Procyonidae member is found in North America? I'll give you a picture of it. Anyone know what that is? Nobody's typing. Okay, there you go. Very good. A coati or a coatimundi. Now these are often kept as pets. I don't know why, but some people have them as pets. But that coatimundi is found southern part of Arizona, a little bit of New Mexico in that southwestern portion. Again, this is another animal I have never seen in the wild. But if you look at all three of these all at once, they're pretty similar. The coati, believe it or not, has some striping on the tail. You can't see it real good, but they're all very similar in shape and size. It's like they have the mask, same body size, so to speak, and that striped tail. So you can see why a lot of these animals are grouped together. Now, there are other animals, like I mentioned, within this family. The red panda is one. There's a whole bunch of animals in South America that fall into this family. And someone mentioned the kinkajou. I'm forgetting them off the top of my head, but a lot of these animals are really adapted to this jungle life. They're very agile in the trees. And so we'll talk a little bit about the characteristics of these animals that are found in this family. And Robert, anytime you want to chime in about the description of these, by all means, just do it. The one thing, when you're looking at the animals within this family, they oftentimes are very bear-like. In fact, a lot of people used to compare them to bears. In fact, when Linnaeus was first devising the system, people put raccoons and bears almost in, I don't know if they're in the same family, but they said they were very, very closely related. Now, genetics has since changed that. I remember my dad used to tell me that raccoons belonged in the same family as bears. That was the thinking many, many, many years ago, but thanks to genetics, we can now differentiate different clades or different family lines. And so we find that the Procyon, the raccoons and those are actually closer to the not the muskrats, the Mustelidae instead of bears. So although they're not as related as once believed, they're very, very similar in many attributes. And so if you look at the bear and the raccoon in that picture there, you see the hand. And that's one thing that's pretty cool about animals within Procyonidae is the way they walk. The way they walk is actually what we would call plantigrade. And so they literally walk on their entire hand, or their entire, as in the case of the back foot, their entire foot. Now, if you look at the diagram on the left, that digitigrade, those are animals that walk on their toes. And believe it or not, all the canids, all the felids, they walk on their toes. And when you look at the tracks between these animals, those canids and felids, they often only show 4 toes because that 5th toe is way up higher on the heel, and so it never touches the ground. So you only see 4 toes. Now, members of the Procyonidae, the raccoons, the ringtail, the coatis, you're going to see all 5 fingers, just like it is with bears as well. You'll see all 5 of the toes in a nice clear print. So they use literally their whole hand or their whole foot when they walk. Another interesting thing about this family is, although they're classified in the order Carnivora, they are probably one of the least carnivorous of all those families. And so they're mostly omnivorous. Don't get me wrong, they eat lots of meat. They'll eat crayfish, they'll eat bugs, they'll eat small mammals if they get their hands on them, but they also eat a lot of non-meat materials. So they're omnivorous, again, very much like bears. So you're starting to see why they were compared to bears so often. And the really cool thing when you look at, I was looking at I'm trying to think of the word. It's not phylogeny. The origin of the word raccoon, in many of the native languages, it was literally translated as water bear, because raccoons are very adept at being around water. And oftentimes you see them washing their food. They eat a lot of crayfish, but a lot of times when they get food, they'll take it over to the stream and wash it. I don't know if that's Robert, I don't know. Do you know the purpose of that behavior? Because raccoons do it, a few other animals do it, but I don't know the evolutionary purpose of that. Would you know it? No idea. Okay. So anyway, the members of this family, the coatis, the ringtails, the raccoons, they're very omnivorous. One of the things that's interesting, and you can tell this from an evolutionary standpoint, is looking at the dentition, or looking at the teeth within the skull. And so these are skulls from a whole host of animals that fall in carnivora. And so on the left-hand side, you have leopards, bears. There's a dog skull there. On the right-hand side, some of the smaller members of carnivora. but I'm going to zoom in on a couple of them, and we're going to talk about some of their teeth. They're called carnassial teeth. And so that picture on the left, I zoomed in on the skull of a leopard. And those carnassial teeth, they're those first molars, but instead, most people think of molars as simply a grinding tool. So when you're chewing something, it just grinds your food together. But these carnassial teeth are unique in carnivores in that the first couple of teeth, besides being able to chew, have this scissor-like effect. They're literally self-sharpening, and what it's designed to do, it's designed to rip and tear meat off bones, and it's very effective. And so these animals like the leopards and the wolves, they have very um, distinct and large carnassial teeth because they're tearing meat off of the animals that they kill. Now, when you zoom in on the carnassial teeth for a raccoon, they're not as distinct. They look like a bad set of molars. And so Procyonidae have one of the least formed carnassial teeth of all the animals within carnivora. And so that's one of the distinctions, and that kind of separates them. And it kind of makes sense since they are primarily omnivorous. They don't have as much of a need to be tearing and ripping meat off carcasses. And so their teeth are more well adapted to eating a whole host of foods that they find. And so that's a big difference between those. Now, believe it or not, that is actually going to be about all I talk about when it comes to Procyonidae. And so does anyone have any questions about any of these three animal species before I move on to the big family? All right. Oh, Katie's typing something. I'm not exactly sure. I imagine it's very similar, but as in the case with raccoons, they'll have a litter, usually between 2 all the way up to 6 kits. I think they're called kits. Um, and as with most mammals, the breeding usually occurs winter, early spring. Those raccoons are trying to drop their young during that late spring or around the green up when there's plenty of food around. And so oftentimes you're going to find raccoon babies late spring, early summer. The one thing with a lot of animals that become habituated, sometimes their cycles can get messed up and they could be dropping, and a lot of it has to do with food availability. But for the most part, truly wild animals, they're programmed to breed at a specific time of the year so their young kind of hit the ground when that green up occurs. So sometime early spring, early to late spring, a lot of those mammals are going to be given birth. Now, the number of animals that they give birth to, I'm not going to get too technical. In fact, I was watching a video the other day of a webinar Robert and I gave with that talked about K-selected and R-selected mammals. R-selected mammals are mammals like rabbits that get preyed upon all the time. They give birth to lots and lots of babies. Or think of a sea turtle. They'll give birth to 100 little sea turtles in hopes that one survived because there's tremendously high mortality rate of the young. Then you have those K-selected, which are, think of them as really good parents. And so bears, humans, elephants, some of these larger animals will only give birth to one or two of the babies. And what their idea is, they have a lot of parental care. They will be with their offspring until they're old enough to be on their own. And so they provide a lot of parental care. And so think of these raccoon as somewhere in the middle. They have a lot of parental care, so they're not literally just dropping their kits on the ground and then running off. They provide that parental care, but it's kind of a middle of the road type of species. So it's not uncommon to see 4 or 5 baby raccoons tagging along behind their mom. All right. So with that, oh, Trish asked another question. Do raccoons hang out in trees a lot? I mostly see them on the ground, but up a tree when a dog barks at night. They are very, I'm going to use a technical term. In fact, I'm going to show you that term later, but we call it arboreal. They use trees a lot. Obviously, think of squirrels. They're in trees a lot. Now, raccoons will oftentimes be on the ground where they're foraging, but they take to the trees. They often den in trees, and so they seek safety in trees. And so they're very used to being up there. And oftentimes that's where you're going to find the raccoon den is in some kind of hollowed out tree. Okay, we're going to move on to this other family. So we covered all of Procyonidae. Now we're going to talk about the really cool family. I like this one. This one's really neat. It's called Mustelidae. And again, we're going to focus primarily on the animals that we find in North America. And so this is where I need you to get your typing fingers on because I'm going to quiz you right off the bat. I'm going to show you animals. You tell me what they are. Okay? So let's start with an easy one. Not a mink. That's just a regular old weasel. And there's a couple of different species of weasel I'll go into a little bit later. Okay, how about that one? What is that? Katie, I don't know if you answered which one, but that is a ferret there on the bottom picture. That's a black-footed ferret. Okay, here's the next one, folks. What do you think that is? Very good, Laura. That is definitely a mink. Next one. We're going to get a little tougher for the next couple. Can anyone tell me what that is? Robert, you can't answer. You're supposed to be teaching. Very good, Laura and Bet. Nice job. That is what we call a pine marten. Some people just call them martens. Then there's this critter. This is not as common as a marten. This is a more northern animal, but it's very closely related to the marten. Awesome. Great job, Laura. You know your mustelids. That is called a fisher. Think of it as just a much larger marten. Some people call them fisher cats, which is not a good thing to call them because they're not really cat. So just a fisher is what that animal is. How about that thing? These are more widespread than I ever knew. Most people will know that. Robert, I'll talk about that. In fact, I'll let you talk about that if you want. We're going to go through each one of these animals individually. All right, everyone knows a badger. What about this one? It's probably rare if anyone has ever seen one of these in the wild because these are truly a northern dwelling creature. Yeah, those are wolverines. All right, then we're going to get to one we just talked about a couple webinars ago. That's the river otter. And tremendous success story about restoring those. Those were mostly wiped out. We're also going to talk a little bit about a close relative. They're the sea otter. Much, much bigger than the river otter. Kind of do the same thing, but those are actually a keystone species, which is really cool. And then there's this guy here. Everyone, or put it this way, there's nothing wrong with thinking that skunks belonged in Mustelidae because they did. For a long time, they were classified as that. But as more and more genetics comes out, we realize they're not as closely related as we thought. So skunks have since been removed from Mustelidae, and Robert mentioned it earlier. They're put in their own family. It's called Mephididae, Mephidae, which I swear we got to get more people working on classification because if you look at the family of skunk, it's Mephididae. The genus is Methydus. The species is Methydus. So they got to come up with something more original than that. So skunks no longer belong to this Mustelidae family. But all these other animals do. And we're going to talk about them individually in a second. But first, I want to talk about why these animals are related. So let's talk about them all at once. So the characteristics of Mustelidae. And so we're gonna talk about some of the similarities that they have. And so if you noticed on all those photos I showed you before, most of those animals I was showing you have this really long, elongated body. And so it's really unique. You don't see too many animals that have that long stretched out body. So if you see a small critter that is abnormally long, more than likely it's going to belong to that Mustelidae family. Another thing that's really cool, obviously having that long body, they tend to have some short legs on them. That black-footed ferret, obviously, same thing with the river otter in that picture. But they also have these really rounded ears, which is it's not unique to their family, but pretty much all the mustelids have these short rounded ears. Another big thing with them is most of them have this luxurious fur, and it's a blessing and a curse all in once because obviously these creatures either living in water or these more normal northern climates need that luxurious warm fur, but because of that, they're highly sought after. So everyone knows minks and mink coats. That was all the rage for a long time. Another animal which is kind of the Russian version of the mink is the sable, and so you've probably heard of a sable coat as well. They're waterproof. They're very thick. They're very warm, and so they all pretty much have this luxurious fur that is found on them. And last but not least, most of them have an anal scent gland that is atrocious. They stink. Now, there is one exception. River otters don't have that anal scent gland. Robert, I don't know if you have any experience with it, but a lot of these weasels and wolverines and some of these, all these animals within Mustelidae can really stink bad. Now, the reason they do that, they use that to mark their territories, so there is a function for it. But I will tell you, when people kind of have ferrets as pets, oftentimes they undergo a procedure to remove that anal scent gland because otherwise they would stink up the house. All right, here's something else about Mustelidae. They're mostly carnivorous, as opposed to Procyonidae, which is omnivorous. These guys like to eat meat, so they're small meat eaters. And it's pretty awesome because some of these critters are actually really small, but what they lack in size, they make up for in ferocity. And so weasels, they're I know a lot of you don't like seeing this or hearing about it, but weasels can take down animals much larger than them. And if it doesn't bother you, when I was researching this, there are so many videos of these weasels, especially in the snow, when they encounter a rabbit that can't run very fast. These weasels come out of nowhere, or either a weasel or possibly a pine marten, sometimes a fisher, and they take down animals much larger than them. And so, besides like a weasel taking down a rabbit, probably the most vicious of them all, and most of you have heard this already, is wolverines. They have an attitude beyond anything else. And they have been known to defend a carcass and keep grizzlies at bay, even though that wolverine is much smaller. Their attitude is absolutely ferocious. And so it's not just wolverines. For their size, weasels can be really nasty. All these critters that belong in Mustelidae can really have an attitude. So these aren't ones that you typically want to play with. A lot of people will see some of these cute little critters and think they're wonderful things to handle, but all of these mustelids, because of their behavior of being mostly carnivorous, can be pretty vicious at times. So just be careful. And I think Robert can attest with the river otters. They'll nip you any chance they get. So those are some of the similarities when it comes to Mustelidae. Well, what are some of the differences? We have all these different animals. Are there differences? Absolutely. There are some, such as the pine marten or even the fisher, that are mostly arboreal. And Trish, there's that word for you. This literally means they spend a lot of time in the trees. And so they hunt in the trees, they live in the trees. They'll come down on the ground, but they do spend a lot of time up in the trees, especially those pine martens and even the fishers. Now, having said that, you have some of these mustelids that are fossorial, and that's a nerdy term. I try not to throw crazy terms out at you, but I want to explain it and hopefully enhance your vocabulary. But what fossorial means is they dig holes in the earth and they live underground. And so species like badgers, they're very fossorial, making holes. Another one is that blackfoot or the ferrets, the black-footed ferrets. They have these extremely complicated networks of tunnels. Wolverines are also very adept at digging into the ground. So a bunch of these mustelids are actually underground, very adept at being underground. What are other differences that they may have? Well, some of them are aquatic or semi-aquatic. Obviously, sea otters and river otters are in the water a whole bunch. But even animals like mink, they live in what we call riparian habitats. So they have no problem going in water. They'll catch fish. And so a lot of those are extremely aquatic or, like I said, semi-aquatic, while others are mostly terrestrial. You have the badgers. You have these weasels can obviously go in water areas, but badgers, black-footed ferrets, those are primarily just earth-dwelling creatures. So you don't have that liking to the water that some of these other mustelids have. Uh, Trish, your question, that means only freshwater? No, when I say aquatic, it can be saltwater too. For example, sea otters are found in the ocean. In fact, I just put a picture of a sea otter up there. I'm going to show their range in a little bit, but just because it says aquatic does not mean freshwater. It can mean freshwater or saltwater. Now, I shouldn't say some are keystone. One is absolutely a keystone species, which is the sea otter. Now, if you ever attended our webinar on trophic cascades or keystone species, we talk about the sea otter and how vital they are to those oceanic ecosystems right off the coast, because what they do is they feed on sea urchins. And when you remove the sea otter from that ecosystem, the sea urchin numbers grow. And unfortunately, sea urchins feed on kelp. And so when you get an overabundance of sea urchins, you lose the kelp, you lose that underground forest, and then you start losing a whole bunch of species. So a sea otter is absolutely a keystone species, and it's a mustelid. It's a little weasel-like animal that is absolutely critical to that ecosystem. But most others, for the most part, they're not keystone species. Now, I will tell you, a lot of them are very, very important. They're all important to the ecosystem. Some of these were extremely, extremely important to humans. I mentioned before the furs. And so minks and otters, a lot of those populations were severely impacted because of the fur trade. We don't have that as much anymore, and so a lot of these species are doing really, really well, even though you probably don't even see them. So, any questions on the similarities or differences between these mustelids? Because then what I'm going to do, I'm going to go through each and every one individually. We'll talk a little bit. I'm hoping Robert chimes in with some stories. All right. Robert, if I miss anything or you need me to answer anything, if you could chime in, because the way my monitors are set up, I can't really see it too easily. Okay, what we're going to do now, I'm going to go through each one of these critters individually. Now understand, when I say weasel, it's not just one species of weasel. There's multiple species. And in fact, a lot of them are found throughout North America, many parts of Europe. And so I'm just going to dabble with some of the more common ones. And so when we're talking about weasels, there's a couple of fairly common ones in North America. There's this long-tailed weasel, And I didn't bother putting in all the Latin names because it's not important. I just want you to learn kind of about these animals. If you want to study wildlife biology, by all means, you could do that. But this is the range for long-tailed weasel. Whenever you see that skinny, long, rodent-like creature running around in the wild that is that two-tone color, in most of North America, you're probably going to be seeing the long-tailed weasel. Now, I will tell you that it has a close relative called a short-tailed weasel. Guess what the difference is? One of the main differences, obviously, is the length of the tail. These tend to be a little bit darker in the color. Their white oftentimes is a little more orangey or sometimes even grayish. But you see their range is kind of more northerly than that long tail. They don't have as extensive of a range in North America. And so long-tailed weasel, short-tailed weasel, those are two of the primary weasel species in North America. Now, can anyone tell me what this animal is? Nobody's typing. Very, very good, Trish. Yes, you're also correct, Laura. It's called an ermine or an ermine. Um, it's also called a stoat. And literally what it is, it's one of those weasels, long-tail, short-tail weasel, that just changes its fur coat to white. Now, if you attended our Cryptic Critters webinar where we talked about camouflage, there's a number of animals that do that. They'll have one coloration fur in the summertime and then another coloration fur in the wintertime. For example, white-tailed ptarmigan. They'll be this mottled brown in the summer, and then when the snow hits, they turn literally completely white because it helps camouflage them. These weasels understand. One thing I forgot to mention, I should have put it in there. The one thing with Mustelidae is they are active all year long. Um, they're not like bears that hibernate. The mustelids are pretty much active all winter long, all year long. Now they may slow down a little bit, but they're still hunting all throughout the winter. And so when you're a weasel trying to hunt some of these other animals, whether or not it's mice or rabbits or whatever, if you live in that northern climate, it's advantageous for you to develop a white fur during periods of snow because it hides you much, much better. And so I think it's just so really, really cool that these animals turn literally completely white during the wintertime. Okay, so those are the weasels. Next one we're going to talk about is black-footed ferrets. Well, this is black-footed ferrets. Robert, do you know, is there any other species besides black-footed? I do think there's a couple of different ferret species. But what I have here as far as the range is the black-footed
in North America. I think the black-footed is the only one we have here.
Okay. Now, the interesting with black-footed ferrets is they are listed, I think they're on the threatened, especially in many of the states. Um, they're not doing too well in some areas. And so the Fish and Wildlife Service has a black-footed ferret program. And in fact, one of the things, if I know Robert's been to New Mexico, where I'm at, we have this Valles Caldera, beautiful area. It's an old active volcano. And we have these prairie dogs, Gunnison's prairie dogs, all over the inside of that volcano. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has recognized that area as a potential release site for black-footed ferrets. But they're waiting to make sure we have enough of their food source because they prey on prairie dogs. And so that could be a potential release area for black-footed ferrets. But I do know in many parts of the country they're struggling and they're trying to reintroduce black-footed ferrets. I don't know what the cause of their decline was, but this is one of the mustelids that we're kind of keeping a close eye out on. But that's the range. They go throughout most of the
I
mid.
can chime in on the cause of decline. one, that area at their end is huge in cattle ranching, and with the demise of prairie dogs or with eradication of prairie dogs, black-footed ferrets only eat prairie dogs. They're a specialist. And so if you take prairie dogs out, there's no food for them. And then, as I think Pat mentioned, sylvatic plague, uh, they don't survive the plague very well, where it can be in a prairie dog town and not affect the prairie dogs very much, but it'll wipe the ferrets out. So 1-2 punch on them there with disease and eradication of prairie dogs. It was so bad they were actually extirpated from the wild. It's a real success story. All the ferrets that are on the land now came from ones brought into captivity after they were thought to be extinct.
Well, look at that. Even the instructor learned something. I know there are some animals that we brought back, but I did not know it was that bad for the black-footed ferret. So thank you so much for chiming in for that. And yeah, that's I didn't recognize or I didn't see that Pat chimed in about sylvatic plague, but that's an issue that we deal with in a lot of these midwestern and western states. Is it's very detrimental to prairie dog populations, and lots of animals depend on prairie dogs. And so obviously Robert mentioned the black-footed ferret, but things like burrowing owls. Burrowing owls rely on prairie dog towns because owls don't burrow in the ground. They have no means of making that hole. And so they rely on abandoned prairie dog colonies in order to lay their eggs. And so, yeah, sylvatic plague, when it comes in, it could potentially wreak havoc with uh, a whole bunch of other animals when it wipes out one particular species. Okay, moving on. The mink. Again, the mink was extremely popular in the fur trade. If you look at the range throughout North America, it's found in almost all parts of North America except that far northern point and the southwestern. Now, the mink are very aquatic. They like being around water. Here's the crazy thing: they're found everywhere in every state. But I'd love to see a show of hands. Has anyone ever seen a mink in the wild? Robert, you don't count. Okay. Well, actually, you guys surprised me because I've only seen mink twice in my life, and I've been in the woods quite a bit. Robert hit on a key thing. That's one of the things to look for a mink. If you see a weasel-like creature, and it's that dark chocolate brown, and it has the white on its chin, that's usually the giveaway that you're looking at a mink. But these are pretty ferocious little animals. The thing that's so crazy about them is they are found in every state. And the vast majority, now you guys, I will tell you, you guys are head and shoulders above the general public. So I would imagine most of the general public has never seen a mink. Um, but they are around and they're mostly nocturnal, so that's why you're not going to see them. But they're really cute little critters that just love hanging around these riparian areas, and they're pretty much found everywhere. Okay, going back to that pine marten. Now, pine martens, again, they're mostly arboreal. If you look, they are a very northern type of species. And so throughout most of Canada, obviously you get into the Rockies, some of those higher mountain chains are going to have pine martens. Um, I don't believe I've ever seen one in the wild. Robert, is there anything you could add on pine martens?
Yeah,
I know you could add on
the pine
Fisher.
martens are extremely arboreal. One way I tell my students to tell them to recognize them, if you look how that white runs up their neck like that, it looks like they're from the Elizabethan times, or is it Elizabethan? Victorian. It's a Victorian collar on their neck from the Victorian era. It looks like they're wearing that all the time. And as we go through others, I'll talk about how that color pattern kind of morphs into different parts of the body to tell them apart. But they're very, very arboreal. They're about 3 times the size of a squirrel, but they can outrun a squirrel and catch it.
Good deal. Well, actually, Robert, keep your microphone on because Oops. Let me go to the next slide.
Fishers are much larger than martins. There should be a little dot right there in about central Tennessee. They were reintroduced into one of our wildlife management areas. And from my understanding, they were reintroduced to control a feral cat population. Uh, but they're also arboreal. First time I ever saw one in the wild, being a wildlife biologist, I had no idea what it was. It was right at daylight, and I heard it coming and saw something I didn't realize what it was. But then it's that characteristic mink, otter, fisher, martin lope that they have. And when it stood up on a stump, I saw it. So I was very lucky to see one in the wild. But very neat little animals, medium sized animals. They're probably raccoon, a little bigger than a raccoon, but they're pretty neat animals. No, my observation was outside
Robert, did
Catoosa on
you
my
have your
property that's
observation
right
in
inside of
Catoosa?
Roane County. So they have left the area.
Well, that's one of those things because Robert mentioned they're reintroduced into Tennessee, and if you look at that range map, fishers probably weren't found much in Tennessee, and I will say that state wildlife agencies are not perfect. Sometimes we experimented with things that we probably look back on and say, yeah, I don't know why we did that. For example, I do know, like in Tennessee, we tried introducing mule deer in the state of Tennessee, and so I'm sure all over the country there's examples of us experimenting. But hopefully, over the last couple of decades, we have gotten away from thinking about individual species and we're more focused on this ecosystem approach. And so we won't do as much experimentation as we have done in decades past. Okay, last couple. This one is way more widespread than I used to believe as a younger child. They're found throughout most of North America. Obviously, the Southeast, Northeast doesn't have them, but all the Midwest, the West, I've seen them killed on the roads. I've never seen one live playing in the field, and I'm anxious to see that. But these are critters. They're large, more broad. You can see they're not the skinny. They're more husky type of weasel-like animal, but they have an attitude. You don't want to mess with a badger. A badger. I will tell you a neat little anecdote. I mentioned it early on in the presentation about how uh, these animals, these mustelids, are mesopredators. So sometimes they're fed on by apex predators. I could look out my window right now and look at the Santa Ana Reservation, and they have a radio collar on a cougar who they nicknamed Broken Leg because they had a broken leg. It has since healed. But good old Broken Leg, he's wandering around out there now. They have a collar on him, and they always go look see what he's feeding on whenever he sits still for a couple of days. And the number one animal in his diet is badgers. He loves eating badgers. And so over the last year and a half, he's eaten like 27 different badgers. He still eats the elk and the antelope and all the bigger critters, but apparently he has developed a taste for badgers. But these are pretty nasty little critters. They're a lot bigger than all the other animals, the weasels, the martins, the fishers. These are, like I said, more robust and stout. So we're getting a little bit bigger in the mustelids. And then you get this guy. This guy is probably the fiercest of all of the mustelids. He's also the biggest. He's pretty robust. He doesn't have as long as slender as a body as some of the other ones. He is elongated compared to like a raccoon or something. But these guys have attitudes, and you see their range. It's the northern. They love that cold climate. And so a lot of the times what they're feeding on is you'll have these winter kill bison or elk or caribou, and they'll claim the carcass. And like I said, they have such an attitude that they oftentimes keep bears at bay because they will just defend their their food source pretty intensely. So, like I said, with all of these mustelids, what they lack in size, they make up in attitude. And so let's switch quickly to some of the more aquatic ones. The river otters, I'm not going to talk about much. We talked about them a couple of webinars ago. Tremendous success story, bringing them back. They're now found in most of the states. They were extirpated. They were wiped out in so many of the states, the lower 48. But now most of them have river otters back. Um, but they are mostly aquatic. They spend a lot of the time in the water. They feed on fish, crayfish. So they're very adept at being in the water. They have a cousin called the sea otter, obviously opposite the river otter. River otter is mostly freshwater, but the sea otter is mostly saltwater. And so they are found along the western coast of North America. And if you look at the range there, it extends all the way up the Alaskan chain, out the Aleutian Islands, and all the way over into Russia and even into Japan. Now, the yellow marking on that range map was their historic range. They were wiped out. Again, very, very, very valuable fur. And so they were trapped, they were shot, they were caught because their fur is so dense, so rich, so highly valuable to humans that their populations were extremely decreased. And so the good thing is they have been coming back in many areas. And so you see, I'm colorblind, so I think it's like a bluish, purplish color beneath that yellow. That is their current range. And so the western half of the United States, California, Washington, a lot of those are still gone. They're coming back. They have returned to Southern California. But when you get up towards that northernmost point and start getting into Canada around Vancouver Island, you'll see sea otters returning. Now, if you sat in on the webinar about spirit bears, river otters are all in that area, and you saw how insanely lush and vibrant and rich those coastal waters can be when all the animals are present. And so, like I said, if you remove sea otters from an ecosystem, oftentimes sea urchins will move in and they destroy those kelp forests, which creates the home for a myriad of other aquatic species. And so when you see a healthy coastal system that we saw on the Spirit Bear webinar, it's just amazing the abundance of life. And a lot has to do with the contributions that sea otters make to that system. So, with that, I'm going to end it and I'll let Robert talk about whatever else he needs to talk about. We could go back to whatever slides, but just understand these mustelids, these forgotten predators, what they lack in size, they make up in heart because they have some pretty bad, pretty cool attitudes, if you ask me. So, do you all have any questions about any of these? And I don't mind going back to any slide you want. And Robert, if you want,
I'll chime in on Chris's question there about the polecat. Polecat is actually a species of mustelid in Europe. It's more like a weasel or a ferret. And I guess when the Europeans came to North America, that's what they equated a skunk to being because of the odor. So polecat is actually an animal in Europe. So that name was just added to the skunk here as a colloquial name. Katie, yes, they are solo hunters. Many of them spend much of their life alone, especially things like wolverines. They won't even tolerate other wolverines around them. Now, some of the weasels, smaller weasels. Go ahead.
Robert, one thing you mentioned before, and one of the things you mentioned before, and I don't know if you
Right.
could
I can. If you notice, pretty much every species we looked at there had a light colored chin and or chest. And that's indicative of about all the mustelids. They all have that light colored chest, and it's just the amount of light color that they have. And then when we got to the Wolverine, it still had that light colored chest and throat in patches, but it had that big saddle on the back of it from the lighter colored fur and that dark saddle right in the middle of it. So when I'm teaching my students how to tell these apart, and in our field, you may be handling just a skin. That's a really good indicator to tell it from a lot of other species. If you think about other species, they don't have that across the species. Bears may or may not have a white spot on their chest. Um, Things like the cats, they're spotted, but they don't have any much white on the chest or anything like that. Same with the canids; they're pretty much uniform coloration. The procyonids, uniform coloration, but these have that white that really sticks out a lot.
And one thing I want to add to that, if you attended the Cryptic Critters presentation that talks about coloration, this is not that white coloration that Robert's talking about now. This is not an example of counter shading. Counter shading is seen, for example, like deer, how they're darker and then they get whiter towards the belly. That is that is the counter shading coloration that helps them blend in from a distance. But this is actually kind of like a distinct patterning that the mustelids have with the dark fur and the white fur. So it's not an adaptation to help them with camouflage. It's just their fur coloration. Now, having said that, when the weasels, when they turn into their winter coat and they're completely
I'll go
white,
back to,
that is a
excuse me,
form of helping them
Trish, you didn't hear my
camouflage themselves.
polecat, and I had to look it up to make sure. If you go buy a ferret in a pet store, that's the polecat. That's the one that was domesticated. So people that have ferrets for pets really have polecats for pets. Oh, absolutely. Well, not all of them. Things like the otters are definitely not nocturnal. They'll move at any time, day or night. Um, Let me think for a minute. Wolverines are not necessarily nocturnal. So there's a mix in there. The only time I've ever seen weasels in the wild was at night. Mink, they're pretty active during the daytime. Um, but so it's really a mix, really a mix.
Yeah, and I could have put that in as far as the differences. Now, Trish, you did kind of hit the nail on the head. The Procyonidae, the raccoons and the ringtails. If you notice, they, especially that ringtail, has really big eyes, and so those are definitely more nocturnal animals than the mustelids. But like Robert said, it's a mixture depending on what animal you're talking about. Um, and so it's a really cool family, and most of the similarities is with their body shape and kind of their behaviors. Not always, but it's a neat family that not many people get to see in the wild, but they're pretty awesome critters. And I originally was going to put in a whole bunch of other pictures of these little tiny weasels taking down rabbits and everything else, and then I realized, yeah, some of my students like rabbits, so I didn't put all those pictures in. They would have been really cool. Okay, let me end a couple more slides. Uh, y'all know where to go. I'm not going to go through this, but appreciate y'all coming back every couple of weeks. You guys are absolutely fantastic. I will tell you, mark your calendars. And again, Robert, this is probably one you would, you could probably, in fact, if you want to teach this class, you can. But 2 weeks from today, I'm going to do something completely different. We are not going to do a class on animals. Tree identification. This is going to be a super basic class. This is not going into details where you're just confused. But it's so powerful to take a walk in the woods, and know what kind of trees you're looking at. It's unbelievable how many people go out there and they can't identify an oak tree or they can't identify a maple tree. And so this is going to be a really, really basic class that's going to teach you some of these large families, kind of what leaves to look for, what bark to look for, because knowledge is power. When you go on a hike and you know what kind of trees that, or what kind of forest you're walking in, it's just a really, really good feeling. And so we're gonna spend an hour just teaching you
No,
some of the basics
I'll
about
come in on it
identifying
and
different trees.
follow along with
So
you.
hopefully you'll like that one. And Robert, you're welcome to do as much or as little of that one as you want. So okay, sounds good. And the other thing I'm going to add, folks, I don't want any of you buying any more of those recordings. You guys are awesome, but if you know of folks that um, are having a hard time during this whole quarantine, stay at home type of thing, we have those recordings available, and I'll work with anyone if you can't afford anything. We made them super, super cheap. So if you have friends or family and you want to purchase them or tell people where they can get them, I pinned that one post to the top of the Wildlife for You page that every one of the recordings, I think there's 54 different recordings that are available. You can buy packages for like $5 and they could have 15 hours worth of learning about wildlife. So those are available. You guys are awesome. I don't want any of you buying more because you're my superstars here. But
Thanks, everybody.
anyway, thank you for joining in. If you have any other questions, comments, anything, don't
No problem.
hesitate to
Send me
shoot
an
us an
email on
email or
that
post it up on
tree
the
class, and
Facebook
I'll join
page.
in on it too.
Thanks for joining in, Robert. I appreciate it. Okay, we'll do. All right, folks, have a great night. I'm going to stop the recording and